Hey everyone, we're back with another exciting episode. Today we have something a little different planned. Today I'm joined by a very special guest to talk about Caribbean medical schools. We're going to talk about what they're really like, how it compares to North American schools, and the challenges and the path to become an MD. Today I'm joined by actually one of my cousins, a very bright young man named Viraj.
Thank you for having me.
So you're actually one of the few people I personally know that went to a Caribbean medical school. So I kind of wanted to ask about your experiences and your input, and maybe it would be guidance for somebody that's considering it. Maybe they're in high school or they're in university right now. So maybe let's start from the beginning. When did you know that you wanted to pursue medicine or wanted to become a doctor?
In high school, I really liked learning about the human body. And then alongside high school, I was also working at my parents' fast food business to help them out, but to also build on my social skills. In the process of all this, I started to really resonate with the idea of helping others with my knowledge of the human body. And I like solving problems and the technical aspect behind a diagnosis. And I also like the idea of communicating it to others in an efficient way.
At that time, did you realize or know how long it would truly take? Or was it just something that you enjoyed, so you thought, okay, let me pursue this and go as far as we need to go?
At the time, a lot of people would just tell me that, yeah, it's a long pathway and it does take a lot of studying and stuff. But I think I was just so consumed into the lifestyle that came with becoming a doctor. I don't know, there's just something really fulfilling about helping others during a time of need. And I genuinely think that it's this sense of fulfillment that will really allow me to enjoy my career and be happy with what it is that I do on a daily basis. So after realizing how fulfilling of a lifestyle that I would get as a physician, I made the choice to essentially follow the path and enroll into an undergraduate degree in medical sciences so that I can get a better idea of what it would be like to become a doctor.
Yeah, so I would, not to boost you too much, but I would say that you went to one of the most top prestigious schools in Canada, and you were in one of the harder programs to get into in Canada, and you graduated from that program with very competitive grades. So I guess the question would be, at what point in university, I mean, you're studying hard, you're getting good marks, you're doing really well, that you saw medical school in Canada as an opportunity, and then maybe if that opportunity wasn't going to happen, you started to look elsewhere to continue your dream to be a doctor?
Basically, a lot of the students that came into my program in first year, I would say the majority of them had the intention of becoming a doctor or at least working in the medical field. But also at the same time, the transition from high school to university was very tough. And I still remember on my first day of classes in undergrad, the professor told the class this statistic where something along the lines of 10% of the students in the entering class would actually end up making it to medical school. Something along those lines.
Do you remember roughly how many people there were?
The class was filled. It was 800 people in the lecture hall.
Wow, so he said of that, only 80 people make
Yeah,
it to medical
something
school.
along those lines. A very small statistic. Yeah.
Wow,
and I
that's
remember
crazy.
at that point, I was so reluctant to believe the statistic. And I guess also a lot of students like myself fall into this self-serving bias where we start to think that for some reason we are better than the statistic, or that statistic doesn't apply to us. But I think later on I started to realize that that statistic was actually pretty accurate. And it truly is very hard to go through undergrad and essentially make that transition from high school to university.
And so what year would you say is when you realized maybe I need to look outside of North America for med schools?
It was around the third year mark. So the marks that I got during my first 2 years were nowhere close to being competitive for Canadian medical schools. And that's when I started looking into alternatives. The thing about me is that I still had the confidence that I would eventually succeed in a medical school setting because I saw that my GPA had an upward trend. Meaning that I was getting the hang of things, and a lot of the time, the process of learning how to learn can be the hardest part in university. And I think that I was finally getting the hang of it.
Yeah, for sure, because I think some people are really strong in just memorizing or regurgitating, which may be good for a test scenario, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's good for a real life scenario. And I think too, not to sell yourself short, but the marks weren't bad, but maybe you can just touch quickly on what's the difference between good marks and med school good marks, because I think that's the crazy part for me that I don't really understand.
I know that for like Canadian medical schools, it's very competitive. You would need like upwards of over a 3.9 GPA to be competitive. And on top of that, you would have to have a really high percentile on the MCAT, which is the entrance exam for medical schools.
Right. So you're talking you have to be a 90, 95, 100% student and then do very well on the test and have extracurriculars
Exactly, yeah.
and so on, which is a crazy resume. And I'm sure tons of people have that resume and still don't get into Canadian med schools.
So the hard reality, though, is that most medical schools take a look at your entire GPA all throughout your 4 years. So for somebody like myself, who was improving in my third and fourth years, I was still competing with students that had a great GPA from the beginning of first year. So that puts students like myself at like a disadvantage, even though ideally we're improving and ideally we're getting the hang of things. And ideally when you place us into a medical school setting, we are likely to succeed since at this point we are getting great marks.
So being in third year, what was your opinion on Caribbean medical schools then at that point? And then what made you think maybe I'm going to pursue this, and how did you learn more about them?
Caribbean medical schools, there's always this stigma associated with going to a Caribbean medical school. I remember being in like undergrad and a lot of people would just give it a bad name due to the fact that so many people end up dropping out. And there is some truth to that. So I kept that in mind whenever I was talking to people to get their input on things.
And was this just you talking to older students that had already done it, or
no? This was from me doing research on like forums, like Reddit and stuff like that. Obviously, there's a huge bias when it comes to these types of forums because the majority of the people writing these negative reviews they tend to be the students that have gone there and have had to drop out due to whatever reason. So I kept that in the back of my head, and I understood that there may have been a bias associated with it.
Right, because of course if you are the one that paid the money and then had to leave, you're not going to be, or you didn't get to achieve your dream even, then you're going to be a little bit salty about it. So after you do this research and stuff, how did you talk to your parents about it? What was their thoughts? And did they kind of have an inkling that maybe Canadian medical school wouldn't be an option, or were they kind of just sure that it'll work out?
I think my parents were pretty supportive about it because the thing with me is that we have a lot of family friends that have actually gone down this pathway, and some of them now are doctors. And as far as I know, all my family friends that have gone to Caribbean medical school are either a doctor right now or are currently in medical school in third or fourth year. So my parents had a positive outlook on it. And I think that it was partly my parents really encouraging me to go forward with it that allowed me to like look further into it to truly understand like the implications that come with Caribbean medical school.
So after you realized that this was an option that you were going to take, was there any special tests? I know you have to take the MCAT. Was there anything supplementary to that you had to do? Are there any qualifications you needed or something different than you would do in Canada or even the US for Caribbean medical schools?
So the way that it works is that Caribbean medical schools, they tend to model the American medical school curriculum. And a lot of the times, in order for them to be accredited, they have to ask for certain prerequisite courses and, of course, the MCAT. So when I was applying to Caribbean medical schools, the process was very seamless because I had already taken the prerequisite courses during my undergrad. And I had already completed my MCAT as well. So the application process was very easy to do. And the good thing about Caribbean medical schools is that they have 3 intakes per year. So say you apply to Canadian medical schools and you don't get in come May, then you can easily apply for the next cycle in Caribbean medical schools. And you don't have to wait that entire year to reapply.
Okay, because I know personally like some friends of mine that have applied for med school and then they didn't get in. And so basically the next year they're either doing a master's or they're going back to school to up their marks, or you're kind of stuck because you're just waiting to apply again. So this kind of avoids that. So let's just kind of lay it all out for a second to recap. So you're in high school, you decide I want to be a doctor. You do the university courses and you find that you're enjoying it and your marks are increasing and you're doing well. But it seems that Canadian med school may just be out of reach because of I'm going to call it a ridiculous requirement for some of the stuff. And so you decide that medical school in the Caribbean is something that you're going to do. So you apply, you get in, and the structure of it's going to be you're studying for 2 years, I think it is, and then you do rotations like how you would do in Canada in school, and then you apply for residence. Is that correct? You were going to spend 2 years on the island, and full disclosure, you've already done those 2 years, everything went well, and you're just setting up for rotations now, but because of the whole virus going on right now, that's all been delayed. Yeah. So tell me, like, from day one on the island, what was it like? What is it like being there, and what's the living conditions, and what should somebody expect being there?
Sure, yes. I'll elaborate on that.
Yeah, because I think this is
for
really
sure.
Interesting.
So the island that I went on and the school that I went to was known as Saba University School of Medicine. So Saba, it's actually a very, very tiny island, and the population's like somewhere along the lines of 2,000 people. And the island is very tiny and it's somewhat inaccessible. You have to take a plane from here to St. Martin, which is like a nearby island, and then you can either take a 15-minute flight to the island or you have to take a ferry. Wow. So yeah, it took me around 24 hours ish or 26 hours to get to the island because we had like a layover and all that stuff. And when we got to the island on, like, as soon as I got there, it was basically me, my mom, my girlfriend, and her mother that were dropping us off. And as soon as we got there, we were greeted by the cab driver, and it was just because of the low population on the island, it's such a community feel, and everybody knows everybody.
Right.
So the cab drivers basically knew that when we got off the ferry, they knew that we were medical students, and we just had to tell them where we were going. So they quickly loaded up our bags onto the truck, and then they drove us to the dorms, which the first semester students stay at. As we were exploring the island for the first couple days with our moms, we came to the realization that there were basically no fast food places. Like, it was so different than normal life in Canada. You don't have McDonald's, you don't have Taco Bell, you don't have Tim Hortons, and it was somewhat hard to adjust to that.
Because I guess if you're so used to suburban or city life that when you're on an island, like, it's not like you can leave really, right? Like, you're stuck on the island. So what was it like though? Like, when you're on dorm, was there meal plans? Would you have to get groceries? Like, what, like the day-to-day kind of thing? What's that like?
Yeah. So, there were 2 grocery stores in my town. The island is super tiny. It has like a diameter of 5 kilometers. So from one end to the other, it's a 5-kilometer trip. And it's very hilly. Like, you have to have a car to get from one city to another because it's just, it would be a crazy workout for you to just walk. So in my town, it's known as The Bottom. That's the town that my school was in, and that's the town where I stayed. So in my town, there were 2 grocery stores. Each grocery store would actually get their shipment of produce every Wednesday morning. And if, say, for example, there was like inclement weather or there was like a hurricane watch or anything like that, then the ferry that would bring the produce in just wouldn't come that week, and it would have to come the next week.
So you just couldn't get groceries.
Yeah, exactly. You would have to live on something like pasta or something like that for that week, or you would have to like manage with something other than just like fresh vegetables and fruits. So I think part of the experience of going to Caribbean medical schools, especially going to Saba, is understanding that you're gonna have to make do with such little resources.
And in terms of, let's call it nightlife or fun things to do, like, what's on the island? Like, what is there
so
to
there
do?
isn't much nightlife. There aren't. There's a couple restaurants here and there, but nothing like you see over here in Canada and the US. For fun, students can go scuba diving or they can go hiking and stuff like that. The truth is, like, there's not really much to do on the island, and in a way that is a good thing because it eliminates absolutely all distractions. I think that's one of the reasons why I was able to study so well, because I just didn't have anything other to do other than to study.
So you kind of miss out on the university experience in a sense, because here, like if you stay on residence, there's bars, there's that kind of stuff. There's, places to go out and you can go home, visit your family, do all that stuff. But on the island, man, like you're there because how often can you really come back or go do stuff, right?
So I think like, for me personally, since I did go to Western, I had the experience of living away from home. I had the experience of like the traditional university lifestyle of like staying in dorms and so for me, I was kind of used to living away from home, and I had my experience of nightlife and whatnot. So for me, adjusting to the Caribbean or adjusting to Saba lifestyle, it wasn't too bad because I had my fair share of like fun, if you would, for lack of like better term.
And I guess from your perspective, I mean, it's all business, right? You're going there to do your job and then to get the rotations and to get the residency. So you're not really too concerned about the vacation aspect of the fun parts.
So much money is on the line, so you really...
So if you don't mind me asking, generally speaking, the islands are in US dollars, correct? And somebody looking to go for a semester, depending on the school, it's obviously going to vary, but what should somebody be kind of prepared to pay for a semester?
So for my school, so it really depends based on the level of accreditation of your school. So they say like there's like the first tier of Caribbean medical schools. It comprises of 5 schools. It includes St. George's, AUA, AUC, Ross, and then my school, Saba. And out of all 5 of those, my school was the cheapest one. So during my time on the island, one semester tuition is around 18,000 US. And that's 4 months of school. Okay.
And how much is Canadian medical school roughly? Would you know?
Canadian medical school, I may be wrong.
Or just if you had to guess.
I may be wrong about this, but as far as I know, I think it's around 25,000 a year. So for all 4 years of Canadian medical school, it would run you around $100,000.
Versus 36 US for a year for 2 years, so 72
So
US.
in Caribbean medical school, you have 3 semesters a year. So
it's 3 semesters a year.
4 months, 4 months, 4 months.
Wow, okay, yeah.
So you're looking at around...
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
okay,
so
right.
it's around 18,000 times 3.
Is it designed that way? 3 months or 4 months, 4 months, 4 months to get you off the island kind of as soon as possible?
I think that it's designed that way just to be able to get through the sheer like volume of material that you would have to know for the first licensing exam.
Right, because that's kind of the key for rotations.
Yeah, exactly. So since it's like a standardized exam, the Caribbean schools, this is like our one shot to kind of prove it to the American medical school system that we also know our stuff. So the Caribbean schools, they really take it very seriously to prep you for the USMLE Step 1 because they know that it's such an important exam for you.
And I guess from their side, I mean, if the schools did not produce doctors, people won't go and pay money in tuition. So it's in their best interest to ensure that it works. Now, like we mentioned earlier, there is a stigma to... I'm going to be honest. Before you went, I had either no opinion on it or a negative opinion on it because I just didn't know anything. I just thought, if you don't get in here, you go there, and then
totally, yeah, that's understandable.
Especially because medicine and science, and that is a totally different field than what I'm in. So my knowledge on this is very weak. But where does the stigma come from? Like, what did you see that, that's not true, or you know what, that actually is true while you were there?
So I think that part of the stigma is true, that there is a high dropout rate. And I think that stems from a variety of factors, partially due to just students not being able to adjust to island life. So that is completely separate from the school. That's something to do with the students not being able to adjust to a new environment, and not being able to just like adjust to not having the luxuries that they had in Canada or the US.
So the hardships of living there, you think, is something that somebody just says, I'm fed up of this now. Like I'm
Yeah, so
going back home.
there's a fair chunk of first semester students that just elect to drop out just because of that reason.
That's crazy to spend all that money just to decide that you don't want to live there. And it has nothing to do with the school. I mean, I understand, but it's also kind of what you signed up for. So, okay, so the island life for sure is a big factor for anybody that would want to go. What else did you see that's not true or kind of is true in terms of stigma or maybe negative views that were debunked while you were there?
I think that there's this like stigma or notion that Caribbean medical schools are just like really rigorous to weed out students. And in my honest opinion, I think that in first semester, that's really not the case with the professors, at least at my school. I think that the professors really tried to do their best to facilitate learning and facilitate our transition to the new environment. So I think that like the Caribbean schools definitely, or at least my school, they definitely did a great part to kind of transition our learning, facilitate our learning so that we understand the content better. And also, since we stayed on the dorms in first semester, there was no worry about just like inconveniences of like not having water or electricity or anything like that.
Was that a problem when you were living in an apartment outside of residence?
So at the dorms, so the way it works at Seba is that there's no central water supply. So the island basically runs on rainwater. So they have these cisterns, which are tanks that collect rainwater, and the houses, they use the rainwater that comes from these cisterns. And as your cistern runs out, you have to actually physically call a truck so that they can get clean water for you and load up your cistern again. So one big convenience of living in dorms in first semester was that you don't have to worry about filling up your cistern or anything like that, or you don't have to worry about filling up the gas in your gas stove.
Just as an outsider, like that sounds crazy, right? I mean, I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. It's just, it's so different than the experience that you would have, let's say, if you'd gone to Canada or the US. So I think it's just, there's one thing I wanted to highlight was just your experience living there, because the fact that people drop out because of living there, to me, is like, you wouldn't drop out because, oh, I'll have to live in Guelph or something. You know what I mean?
That's true.
Versus Toronto or versus Sudbury, wherever you're comfortable living. So I don't know, I just want to touch on that because I think when you were telling me about it, like over the years, that it was just such a big shock.
Yeah, for sure.
From what I'm hearing from you, it seems that the at least schooling aspect of the med school is pretty competitive or similar to what you experience in Canada, the US. So was that your take, even talking with friends that may have done med school elsewhere? And, you know, were you confident in the education that you were getting?
I think that the professors definitely go out of their way to help the students, especially in first semester, since they do such a good job at making sure the students transition properly. Like, for example, I remember walking into anatomy lab during the first week of classes, and the course coordinator already knew my name, which definitely made me feel that they definitely go out of their way to value their students' education. Never in undergrad did I enter an anatomy lab and the professor knew my name within the first week. So that's definitely a good sign. And another thing is that our class sizes were very small as well. So if you had any questions or anything, you could easily approach the professors and ask them to clarify like a concept or anything like that.
And you felt that the professors and everybody were top of the line, like everybody was, you felt confident and comfortable?
Yeah, for sure. They were definitely very adequate. We have faculty from all around the world. There are PhD professors, there are MDs from Canada and the US. And additionally, we do have some professors from the Philippines, some professors from India. So you have that vast, diverse knowledge of medicine. And this actually really, you don't get to see that here, but in Caribbean medical school, when we're taking our clinical skills courses where they teach us how to do a physical exam, having the knowledge of
Right.
how certain professors learn how to do their physical exam in India, and then how some professors learn how to do their physical exam in Philippines, and just having that vast knowledge, I think that it's very helpful. And it's really interesting to see how these professors do things in such a different way all across the world.
One thing you keep mentioning is you say your school, and that's because on the Caribbean islands, there are quite a few number of medical schools
Exactly.
out there. And as you mentioned, they're in different tiers. So could you just quickly go over maybe, you don't have to name all the schools, but what makes you a top tier school? What makes you a lower tier school? And if you were only accepted into a lower tier school, is it still worth going, or is this even more difficult path going forward?
I think that to qualify for a top tier school, you would need to be accredited in Canada and the US. So there's this thing called the World Directory of Medical Schools. And it's this central body that does the accreditation process behind all these Caribbean medical schools and any school across the world. So all these top tier schools, it's like, now it's 7 schools that fall into that list. I would say that they're all accredited across the world. They model their curriculum behind like American schools. So you know that when you're learning your stuff, you are essentially trained in a way to eventually practice medicine in the US. So, the last thing that kind of puts a school in the top tier is having American hospital affiliations. So one thing that really helps me out when applying to the match and getting my residency position is the fact that my school has affiliations in the US for our clinical rotations. So in the US, during my 3rd and 4th year, I don't have to worry about finding sites to rotate at. My school already has that covered. And say I perform really well at the site and the hospital staff really like me, when it comes time for me to apply to the match, they can put in a good word for me, or they would be more inclined to accept me as a doctor.
So let's say if you're a Canadian person who went to med school in the Caribbean. If you were to apply now for rotations or residency in Canada or the US, you're considered, even in Canada now, a foreign student, is that correct? And now, because of the affiliations, you have now pretty much, you're going to be doing rotations. You're just unsure now what city you're going to be in the US, just because of everything going on right now with COVID and all that. And so after that's done, it's more likely that residency will be attainable in one of the cities or one of the places you've done your rotations at. And so if your ultimate goal is to come back to Canada, what would that look like?
The way it works for Canada is that even the medical students over here, they have to write some licensing examinations. So for me, I have to write 2 licensing examinations. There's the NAC OSCE, which is like a clinical practical exam. And then there's the MCCQE, which is the multiple choice exam. So the way it works for me is that I complete my medical school curriculum. I complete the first 2 years. I do my rotations in 3rd year at American sites. And then in 4th year, I do have the option to apply to elective rotations in Canada. And somewhere along this process, I also have to find time or allot time to write the licensing examinations. So once I have the licensing examinations done, and say, for example, I do an elective rotation at one of the Toronto hospitals, I am in a good position to apply for the Canadian match.
And if it happens where you end up only doing rotations in the US and you do your residency in the US, is it the same idea where you just need to now apply back with all the licensing and stuff to be eligible to practice in Canada?
Yeah, so the way it works is that if I do match into the US, I would have to complete the select years of that specialty. If it's something like family medicine, then it could be 2 to 3 years. If it's something like surgery, then it could be 5 to 7 years. So I complete all that. I become a board certified doctor at that point. I would have my MD. I would be a full-fledged doctor that's board certified after completing that residency. And then it's just a matter of writing the necessary licensing examinations, and then coming back to Canada if I really want to.
From your perspective, the hard part is generally done. I mean, you've gone through living conditions, you've gone through the studying, and it's a matter of just making sure your rotations work out and then getting a resident spot. Is getting a resident spot coming as a Caribbean student challenging, or is it sort of that once you're gone through the rotations, at least within the city that you're in or the hospitals that you've been at, from your experience, from what you've seen in this numbers show, that getting residency is pretty likely?
Talking to people and talking to like upper years and whatnot, it's definitely, you do have to work harder than your American counterparts. For me to match something like surgery, for example, it is possible. It is possible for me to match general surgery. However, for an American student to match general surgery, they would have to get a lower score on the USMLE Step 1, and I would have to get a higher score just to pass the screening process and to make the residency program directors really understand that you are a qualified and a competent applicant.
But from a general practice GP's standpoint, because I think the scary part would be to end up with an MD but not be a practicing doctor. But I what I'm hearing from you and from other people I've talked to is that once you're that far down the line, Caribbean or not, it doesn't really matter. You probably will be a GP, most likely. It's just a matter of will you get the specialization you want.
Biggest factor that kind of dictates whether or not you will match is this exam, the USMLE Step 1. You want to do really well on the Step 1. If you, God forbid, if you fail the USMLE Step 1, then of course that puts you in a really bad position. And that's not specific to just Caribbean students. Even if an American med grad failed the Step 1, they would also have a very hard time applying and matching into even something like a GP position.
But at the same time, like you've been prepared through schooling, so you would think that if you had a good education, you're going to be fine. As long as you have the work ethic.
So I think that the school does a good job at prepping us to make sure that we pass the USMLE Step 1 on our first try. And not only pass, but also get like a very high mark. Because what the school does is that once you finish the first 2 years on the island, they have what's called an exit exam. And that exit exam is essentially like a practice Step 1 exam. So they require you to pass that exit exam in order for you to even be eligible to sit for the USMLE Step 1. So
because they have an incentive to make sure you do well, right? Because they want to have results that people are doctors.
So this is just their way of making sure that, okay, our students are qualified enough to write the Step 1 and still get like a great mark on it.
So to kind of start wrapping this up, to summarize everything that I've heard from you, and I think your insight is very valuable, because for somebody like myself who, you know, if I have a child that says, hey, maybe med school in Canada or the US is not going to work out and the Caribbean's an option, or you have cousins or you have, you know, younger high school students that are university students that are looking at it. This is, from what I'm gathering from you, a viable option, but it's not for everybody. You have to be mentally tough to live on the island and get through that part. And then you have to have the work ethic to do well in the studying, do well in your classes, and do well on these entrance exams.
Yeah.
So that you can get to the next step of doing well on the MLE 1?
Yeah, exactly. The USMLE Step 1.
And you need to do well on that and progressing. And you have to have the mindset that maybe I'm not going to be my desired location for a little while, but if my goal is to be a doctor, then this is a totally viable path to do it. Is there any regret that you have, and what's a pleasant surprise to you that you've been there?
So I think that I say that this is a regret, but I think everything in life happens for a reason. So I would say that one of my biggest regrets, I guess, is not trying hard enough during my undergrad, especially during the first 2 years, because had I performed well during my first 2 years and also my last 2 years in undergrad, I would not have had to go to the Caribbean medical school pathway, and rather I would be able to go to a Canadian or an American school. But I think that at the same time, I think that everything does happen for a reason. I think that throughout this entire process, I have become tougher. I have become more resilient. And this entire process has ultimately made me value my education so much more. I know that after going to a Caribbean medical school and after putting in this much work into my career, as a doctor, I know that I'm going to take my job very seriously. I'm going to treat my patients with the utmost respect because I know that it has been a very hard journey to get to that point.
Yeah, and I think so many people do careers and jobs that they're not even sure if they like it. So this is kind of the most ultimate test to say, hey, this is my dream, I'm going to follow it. And I have to give you a lot of credit because I don't think I know I couldn't do it. I don't know if I could leave home to live in, the island kind of life, the way you're describing it, and then go through all this after, because it's not just the med school, right? It's everything after too. So I have to give you a lot of credit.
Thank you.
That you've actually done it all and it's all going to work out. So I think that's incredible.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Well, I just want to thank you for your time. I really appreciate all the insights you gave. And I think a lot of people are going to have their eyes opened by this. So I really appreciate it. All right. That's it, everyone. Thanks.